And what branch did you claim to serve in, madam? Judge Marcus Thorne's voice, slick with the unearned authority of his youth, echoed in the cavernous, wood-paneled courtroom. He leaned forward, his black robes bunching at his shoulders, peering down from the bench at the small, elderly woman standing before him. Alara Vance stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She was there for a zoning dispute, a ridiculous complaint from a new neighbor about the height of her rose bushes along a shared fence line. Her public defender, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, had assured her it was a formality, but Judge Thorne seemed intent on making it something more. Alara's file noted her status as a veteran, a single-line item meant to afford a modicum of respect. To Thorne, it was an opening for sport. He saw a frail woman with silver hair pulled into a tight, neat bun, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes a pale, placid blue. He saw weakness. The file says United States Air Force, he continued, not waiting for an answer. Secretarial pool? Logistics? It was a different time, after all. Not every service member sees action. A few sycophants in the jury box tittered nervously. Sarah Jenkins shot to her feet. Your Honor, my client's service record is not pertinent to a discussion about fence-line horticulture. Thorne waved a dismissive hand, his gaze never leaving Alara. I am trying to establish character, counselor, to understand the person standing before my court. A veteran should understand rules, order, and respect for authority. The implication was clear. Her defiance of the zoning code was a defiance of his court. Alara did not flinch. She simply watched him, her breathing even, her posture straighter than the bailiff's standing by the door. Her silence was not empty. It was a vessel, heavy with things unsaid, and it unnerved the judge more than any outburst could. He wanted to crack it. He wanted to prove it was a hollow facade. Did you even have a rank, Madam Vance? Or do you just use the veteran title for the parking spots and the diner discounts? The cruelty was deliberate, a surgeon's scalpel wielded by a butcher. Sarah was aghast. Objection. Your Honor is badgering my client and showing extreme prejudice. Objection overruled. Thorne snapped, his voice rising. I want an answer. This court deserves an answer. What was your role in the Air Force, Alara Vance? For the first time, Alara's eyes shifted, a flicker of something ancient and weary passing through them. She looked at her lawyer, a silent communication that said, let it be. Then she turned her gaze back to the judge. The courtroom held its breath, expecting a defense, an explanation, anything. She gave him nothing but silence. The judge's face began to flush, a blotchy red creeping up his neck. He was a man accustomed to control, to the immediate gratification of his authority being recognized and obeyed. This silent, unassuming old woman was denying him that, and in the public theater of his own courtroom, it was an intolerable offense. He saw her composure not as dignity, but as insolence. You know, he mused, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers, in my grandfather's day, they had names for each other. Nicknames. Call signs. The men who flew the big bombers, the men in the trenches. They earned those names. They meant something. It was a brotherhood. He let the words hang in the air, a deliberate exclusion. I highly doubt your particular contribution warranted such a distinction. But I am a curious man. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper that carried to every corner of the room. Tell you what, Madam Vance. Let's make this simple. Forget the rank. Forget the unit. Just tell the court your call sign. Surely, even you had a call sign. Sarah Jenkins was on her feet again, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. Your Honor, this is completely out of line. My client's service may have been of a sensitive nature. This line of questioning is inappropriate and potentially a violation of her rights and sworn duties. Sworn duties? Thorne laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Counselor, she's here because her roses are 6 inches too high. I think we can dispense with the cloak and dagger theatrics. Her duties now involve pruning shears. The insult was so petty, so profoundly disrespectful, that a low murmur rippled through the public gallery. An old man in a VFW hat slowly shook his head. A young woman in the front row looked at the judge with open disgust. Thorne, however, was insulated by his own ego. He was playing to an audience of one, himself. He pointed a finger at Alara, the gesture a weapon. I am growing tired of this. Your contempt for this proceeding is noted. I am issuing a direct order. State your call sign for the record. Refusal to do so will result in you being held in contempt of court. The threat was absurd. To jail an octogenarian over a gardening dispute because she wouldn't answer a question that had no bearing on the case was a gross abuse of power. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to threaten appeal, but a gentle, almost imperceptible shake of Alara's head stopped her. Alara Vance took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the room seemed to thin, the ambient noise of shuffling papers and quiet coughs ceasing entirely. Everyone was looking at her, this quiet woman who had suddenly become the immovable object to the judge's supposedly unstoppable force. The bailiff, a man who had seen 20 years of drama in this very room, found himself unconsciously straightening his tie, his hand resting near his sidearm not out of threat, but out of a sudden, inexplicable tension. Alara's lips parted. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, devoid of tremor or emotion. It was a voice that had given orders under unimaginable pressure, a voice that had spoken words of life and death into a crackling radio half a world away. It was a voice that carried its own authority, one that had nothing to do with robes or gavels. Valkyrie 7. The two words dropped into the profound silence of the courtroom. They hung there, vibrating in the air like a struck chord. Judge Thorne blinked. The name meant nothing to him. It sounded fanciful, mythological, like something a child would invent for a game. A smirk returned to his lips, the flush of victory coloring his cheeks. He had broken her. He had forced her to invent some silly, dramatic name. Valkyrie 7, he repeated, his voice dripping with saccharine mockery. How very theatrical. Did you ride a winged horse to the commissary, Madame Vance? He was about to deliver another witty retort, to officially find her in contempt for her perceived mockery of his court, when a sound from the back of the room cut him short. It was a sharp, involuntary gasp, followed by the clatter of a wooden cane hitting the marble floor. The old man in the VFW hat was now struggling to his feet, his eyes wide, his hand pressed to his chest. He was staring at Alara Vance not as a defendant, but as if he were seeing a monument. The bailiff's hand, which had been near his weapon, now came up in a slow, almost unconscious gesture of a salute before he caught himself and dropped it, his face pale. Thorne's triumphant expression faltered. He looked from the old man to his bailiff, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He didn't understand. They were just words. Silly, meaningless words. But they had acted as a key, unlocking a reaction in the room that he could not comprehend. He was no longer in control. The atmosphere had shifted, the power dynamic tilting on an axis he couldn't see. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer tense. It was thick with a dawning, terrifying awe. Alara Vance simply stood there, her duty done, her words spoken, waiting for the inevitable consequences she had known would come. She had not spoken that name in over 50 years. To her, it was not a title of honor, but a burden of memory, a ghost she had long since made her peace with. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a force that made them bang against the stoppers, the sound like a thunderclap. Every head swiveled. Standing in the doorway were two Air Force Security Forces airmen, their blue berets crisp, their M4 rifles held at a formal, ceremonial port arms. They were flanking a tall, imposing figure, a man in a deep blue service dress uniform, the jacket adorned with more ribbons than anyone in the room could count. 4 silver stars glittered on each of his shoulder boards. He was a full general. He paid no mind to the judge, the bailiffs, or the stunned audience. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room and found their target instantly. He moved with a purpose that parted the crowd like a ship through water. General David Wallace, commander of Air Combat Command, walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He did not stop at the bar. He did not address the bench. He walked directly to the defendant's table where Alara Vance stood. He stopped precisely 3 feet in front of her. His back straightened into a rigid line. He brought his hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone that resonated with command. "It is an honor to see you again." The entire courtroom was frozen. Jaws were agape. Sarah Jenkins looked from the 4-star general to her quiet, elderly client and back again, her mind struggling to process the scene. Judge Thorne sat on his bench, utterly paralyzed. He was a local judge in a mid-sized city. A four-star general had just entered his courtroom without permission, ignored him completely, and saluted a defendant in a zoning dispute. The world had just turned upside down. Alara Vance looked at the general. For the first time, a flicker of warmth entered her pale blue eyes. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. At ease, David. You'll cause a scene. General Wallace held the salute for a second longer before smoothly dropping his hand. I believe the scene has already been caused, ma'am. Only then did he turn his attention to the man on the bench. His gaze was not angry. It was far worse. It was cold, clinical, and utterly dismissive. He looked at Judge Thorne the way a biologist might look at a specimen under a microscope, an object of mild, academic curiosity that was about to be dissected. Judge Marcus Thorne, the general stated, his voice now devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of command, the voice that sent bombers into the sky and moved entire armies. I am General David Wallace. I am here on behalf of the Department of Defense and by direct authority from the Pentagon. General Wallace took a step toward the bench, his polished black shoes making no sound on the floor. He moved with the quiet lethality of a predator. You have, in your judicial capacity, demanded that a citizen reveal classified information protected under National Security Act of 1947 and subsequent executive orders. You have attempted to compel the breaking of a lifelong vow of silence, sworn by an operative of a highly classified, special access program. Judge Thorne finally found his voice, though it was a weak, reedy thing. This is my courtroom, General. You have no authority here. This woman is a defendant in a civil matter. This woman, General Wallace interrupted, his voice cutting through thorns like tempered steel, is Colonel Alara Vance, United States Air Force, retired. Though her official, public file ends at Captain, a convenient fiction we created for her protection upon her retirement. He gestured vaguely toward Alara. And the name you so carelessly demanded. Valkyrie 7 foot. He paused, letting the name settle in the room again, this time with its proper weight. Your Honor, you seem to enjoy history. Let me give you a lesson. The general's eyes swept the room, commanding the attention of every single person. During the most dangerous days of the Cold War, there were missions deemed too sensitive for the CIA, too politically risky for the Navy SEALs, and too technologically demanding for anyone else. Missions into contested airspace, deep behind enemy lines, where capture meant certain death and official disavowal by the country you served. For these missions, the Air Force created a ghost program. Project Valkyrie. A hush fell over the courtroom, so deep that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a roar. It was comprised of the 9 best female pilots and intelligence operatives this nation has ever produced. They flew experimental aircraft that don't exist in any public record. They gathered intelligence that prevented at least 3 separate incidents from escalating into full-scale nuclear war. They were ghosts. They had no rank, no uniform, no official existence. They had only a number. Valkyrie 1 through 9 inch. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Alara with a look of profound, almost reverent respect. This woman was not just one of them. She was their commander. She was the one they called when the mission was impossible. She was, and is, Valkyrie 7 inch. The old man in the VFW hat was now openly weeping, his hand covering his mouth as he stared at the woman he had only moments ago seen as a fellow citizen in trouble. He knew the legends, the whispers among old intelligence circles of a group of female pilots who did the impossible, but he'd always thought they were just myths, barroom stories to inspire recruits. The general continued, his voice a low, steady indictment. Valkyrie 7 flew a reconnaissance mission over the Ural Mountains in an experimental hypersonic aircraft in 1968 to confirm the location of a new Soviet ICBM silo, a mission from which SAC pilots in SR-71s had been shot down. She did it, photographed the site, and evaded 3 squadrons of MiGs on her way out, all with a damaged engine. Her intelligence single-handedly altered the balance of power in the SALT negotiations. He took another step closer to the bench. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, she flew a lone, unmarked jet into a Syrian kill zone, using experimental electronic warfare gear to fool their entire air defense network into shutting down, creating a safe corridor for Israeli supply planes. The White House never acknowledged it. The Israeli government never knew who to thank. They thanked God. They should have thanked Valkyrie. 7-inch Judge Thorne was shrinking in his chair, the black robes that had once been a symbol of his power now looking like a funeral shroud. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. He understood now. He understood the gasp from the old veteran. He understood the bailiff's aborted salute. He had not been questioning a simple veteran. He had been blaspheming in a temple he didn't even know existed, in front of a living deity of modern warfare. The general's voice was now barely above a whisper, yet it carried more menace than any shout. The women of Project Valkyrie sacrificed everything. Their names, their families, their right to be recognized. They accepted that they would live and die in anonymity to keep this country safe. When the program was disbanded, their records were sealed at a classification level higher than the schematics for our nuclear arsenal. To speak their call signs, even to each other, was forbidden. They took a vow. He locked his eyes on Thorne's. A vow you just used the authority of this court to force Colonel Vance to break. The finality in his tone was absolute. The judge's career was not just in jeopardy. It was over. It had ended the moment Alara Vance had uttered those two words. This is no longer a civil matter, Judge Thorne, the general stated, his voice returning to its formal, official tone. This is now a national security incident. Your actions have been reported to the Department of Justice and the presiding judge of this district. A formal inquiry by the Judicial Conduct Commission will be convened. I imagine the Department of Defense will also be filing a civil suit against you personally for the endangerment of a national asset. Thorne opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. His gavel, his robes, his title, it was all stripped away, rendered meaningless by the quiet dignity of the woman he had tried so hard to humiliate. General Wallace turned his back on the judge, a final, damning gesture of dismissal. He faced Alara Vance once more, his expression softening. Colonel, on behalf of a grateful nation, I apologize for what you were just subjected to. Alara simply offered a small, tired smile. The boy is arrogant, David. He lacks the wisdom to understand that the deepest waters are often the most still. He will learn, the general nodded. He will. Ma'am, with your permission, my people will handle the horticulture dispute. A faint smile touched his lips. We have some experience with border negotiations. He then offered her his arm. May I escort you out? Alara looked at Sarah Jenkins, her young, overwhelmed public defender, and gave her a reassuring nod. Then, she placed her frail, age-spotted hand on the arm of the four-star general. As they turned to leave, a rustling sound filled the courtroom. It started with the old man in the VFW hat, who was now standing as straight as his old bones would allow. Then the bailiff came to full, rigid attention. Then, one by one, the people in the gallery rose to their feet. Lawyers, clerks, citizens, the very people Judge Thorne had tried to impress with his petty tyranny, all stood in silent, solemn respect. They weren't standing for a general. They were standing for the small, quiet woman in the simple dress, the woman who had carried the weight of a secret, heroic life with grace and silence. They stood for Valkyrie 7. As she walked down the aisle, her steps slow but steady, a profound and lasting silence was the only sound that filled the room. It was the sound of recognition, of honor, and of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Judge Marcus Thorne was left alone, sitting on his high bench, a small and insignificant man in a vast, empty courtroom that was no longer his. He was a footnote in the history of a woman whose real name would never be written in any public record, but whose legacy was etched into the very fabric of the nation's survival. The mighty gavel lay untouched before him, a child's toy, its power utterly broken. Outside, the sunlight was bright. General Wallace led Alara to a waiting black sedan, the kind that usually carried cabinet secretaries. One of the Air Force guards opened the door for her, his movements precise and reverent. Will this be in the papers, David? Alara asked quietly, her voice holding a note of concern. I have no desire for any of this. The general helped her into the car before answering. We'll do our best to contain it, Colonel. We'll classify the court records under national security. The story will be that the case was dismissed due to a procedural error. Most people will forget, but some won't. He looked back at the courthouse. The people in that room today learned a valuable lesson. One that this country is in danger of forgetting. And the judge? She asked, not with malice, but with a quiet curiosity. His career is over, the general said simply. He will be allowed to resign for personal reasons to avoid a larger scandal. He'll spend the rest of his life as a cautionary tale told in whispers at legal conventions. He flew too close to the sun, and the sun turned out to be you. Alara leaned her head back against the seat, a sigh escaping her lips. I'm not the sun, David. I'm just a tired old woman who likes her roses. The general smiled, a genuine, warm smile. With all due respect, ma'am, you were never just anything. He closed the door gently. As the car pulled away, Sarah Jenkins, the young public defender, came rushing out of the courthouse. She watched the sedan disappear down the street, her case files clutched to her chest. She had come to court that morning to argue about a fence. She was leaving having stood in the presence of living history. She knew that for the rest of her life, every time she saw a quiet, unassuming elderly person, she would look at them with a newfound sense of wonder and respect, forever asking herself what silent, heroic stories they might be carrying. The story of Valkyrie 7 would not be told in headlines, but it would be told. It would be told by a humble bailiff, a weeping veteran, and a young lawyer, a quiet reminder that the greatest heroes are not the ones who seek the spotlight, but the ones who serve in the shadows, their silence the only medal they ever need.